The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, a small frontier town where hope and desperation walked hand in hand. Sarah clutched her 3-month-old son closer to her chest as she stumbled down the wooden sidewalk, her worn boots making hollow sounds against the weathered planks. The baby's weak cries had grown quieter over the past 2 days, and that silence terrified her more than his loudest wails ever could. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 6 weeks now, killed in a mining accident that crushed more than just rock and timber. The mine company had offered their condolences and exactly $12 in compensation, barely enough to bury him properly. Since then, Sarah had watched their small savings disappear like water in desert sand, first to the doctor who couldn't save Thomas, then to the undertaker, and finally to the landlord who showed no mercy for a widow's tears. The white steeple of Cedar Falls Community Church rose before her like a beacon of hope. Sarah had heard that Reverend sometimes helped families in desperate situations, though she had never imagined she would be one of them. Just 3 months ago, she had been a respected miner's wife with a comfortable home and a bright future. Now she was just another casualty of the unforgiving frontier life. Her legs trembled with exhaustion and hunger as she climbed the 3 wooden steps to the church porch. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days, giving what little food she could find to her infant son. The world began to spin around her, the familiar dizzy sensation that had been growing stronger each day. She pressed her back against the heavy oak doors of the church, trying to steady herself, but her body had reached its limit. The baby's soft whimpers echoed in the morning air as Sarah's knees buckled beneath her. She managed to protect her son as she collapsed, cradling him against her chest even as consciousness began to slip away. The rough wooden porch felt cold against her face, and she could taste dust mixed with the metallic tang of blood from her split lip. Through her fatting awareness, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, the creak of leather saddles, and the low murmur of men's voices. Someone was coming, but whether they would be her salvation or simply witnesses to her final moments, she could not tell. The baby's cries grew louder, as if sensing his mother's distress, his tiny voice the only thing keeping her tethered to consciousness. Sarah's mind drifted to memories of better times. She remembered her wedding day, when Thomas had promised to build her a house with a garden where their children could play. She thought of the small cabin they had shared, with its stone fireplace and the rocking chair Thomas had carved for her when she was pregnant. All of that was gone now, sold to pay debts or abandoned when she could no longer afford the rent. The sound of boots on wooden steps pulled her back to the present. Someone was climbing the church porch, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Sarah tried to open her eyes to speak, to explain her situation, but her body refused to obey. She could only lie there, holding her baby, hoping that whoever had found them possessed some measure of human kindness. A shadow fell across her face as someone knelt beside her. She felt gentle hands checking her pulse, heard the rustle of fabric as someone examined the baby. The stranger's touch was surprisingly gentle, and she caught the scent of leather, horses, and something else, perhaps tobacco and coffee, the smell of a man who lived and worked in the open country. Her son's cries seemed to stir something in the stranger, for she heard him speak in low, urgent tones to someone else. There were at least 2 men, possibly more, and they seemed to be discussing what to do with her and the baby. Sarah tried once more to speak, to tell them her name, to explain that she wasn't a vagrant or a beggar, but a respectable woman fallen on hard times. The morning sun grew stronger, warming her face even as her body grew colder. She could hear more people arriving, their voices mixing together in a concerned murmur. Someone mentioned fetching the doctor. Another voice suggested the reverend, and through it all, the steady presence of the man kneeling beside her remained constant. As consciousness slipped further away, Sarah's last clear thought was a prayer that her son would survive even if she did not. She had failed as a wife, unable to save her husband from the mine accident. She had failed as a mother, unable to provide for her child. But perhaps in this moment of complete vulnerability on the steps of God's house, someone else would succeed where she had not. James had built his empire from nothing more than determination and an old horse, transforming thousands of acres of wild territory into the most prosperous ranch operation in 3 counties. At 42, he commanded respect from every banker, politician, and business owner from Cedar Falls to the territorial capital. His weathered hands and piercing blue eyes told the story of a man who had fought nature, outlaws, and economic hardship to carve out his place in an unforgiving land. He had ridden into town that morning with 2 of his most trusted men, planning to meet with the bank president about expanding his cattle operation. The sight of a woman collapsed on the church steps stopped him cold. In his 20 years on the frontier, James had seen plenty of hardship, but something about this particular scene struck him differently. Perhaps it was the way she held the baby even in unconsciousness, or the obvious quality of her dress despite its current condition. "Ma'am," he said softly, dismounting from his horse with practiced ease. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, yet there was an unexpected gentleness in his tone. He knelt beside the young woman, noting the pallor of her skin and the way her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. The baby in her arms couldn't be more than a few months old, and its cries spoke of hunger and distress. "Boss, should I fetch Doc?" asked Pete, one of his ranch hands, a grizzled man who had followed James through cattle drives and Indian raids without question. "Yes, and quickly," James replied, never taking his eyes off the woman and child. "Tell him it's urgent, and find Reverend while you're at it." James carefully examined the situation. The woman's clothes, though dusty and worn, were well made. Her hands showed calluses, but not the deep scarring of someone who had worked manual labor their entire life. This was no common vagrant, but someone who had fallen on hard times. Her wedding ring, though simple, was real gold, and he noticed the way she instinctively protected her child even while unconscious. "What do you make of it, boss?" asked his other companion, a young man whose family had worked for James for over a decade. "Widow, I'd guess," James said, gently checking the woman's pulse at her wrist. It was weak but steady. "Lost her husband recently, by the look of things. See how she's holding that baby? That's a mother who's been doing everything alone." James had a keen eye for reading people and situations, a skill that had served him well in business and kept him alive in dangerous times. He could see the signs of recent grief in the woman's face, the weight loss that spoke of giving food to her child rather than eating herself, and the desperate quality that clung to someone who had exhausted all other options. Doctor arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand and his usual serious expression even more grave than usual. The elderly physician had delivered half the children in Cedar Falls and tended to their parents through countless ailments and injuries. He took one look at the situation and immediately knelt beside the unconscious woman. "Severe malnutrition and exhaustion," he diagnosed after a quick examination. "When did you find her?" "Just now," James replied. "We were heading to the bank when we saw her collapse." Doctor carefully examined the baby, who had quieted somewhat in the presence of so many people. "The child needs food immediately. He's dehydrated and underfed. The mother, well, she's given everything to keep this baby alive." Reverend appeared, his black coat flapping as he hurried up the church steps. The middle-aged minister had known hardship himself, having lost his own wife and children to fever several years earlier. His face showed immediate concern and compassion as he surveyed the scene. "Do we know who she is?" the Reverend asked, producing a key to unlock the church doors. "No identification that I can see," James said. "But she's not from the streets. This woman has seen better days." They carefully moved Sarah inside the church, laying her on a pew cushioned with borrowed blankets. The cool interior provided relief from the morning sun, and the sacred space seemed to offer a measure of peace to the desperate situation. Doctor continued his examination while Reverend prepared a place for the baby. "She needs immediate nourishment and rest," Doctor declared. "The baby needs milk and soon. Is there a nursing mother in town who might help?" James found himself making decisions without fully understanding his motivation. "Take them to my hotel suite. I have the rooms reserved anyway, and it's more comfortable than anywhere else in town. We can get proper food and care there." Both the doctor and Reverend looked surprised at this generous offer. James was known for his business acumen and fair dealing, but he wasn't typically given to charitable gestures toward strangers. "That's very generous of you, James," Reverend said carefully. "But are you certain? We don't know anything about this woman's circumstances." "I know enough," James replied firmly. "She's a mother trying to protect her child, and she collapsed on the steps of God's house. That's sufficient for me." As they prepared to move Sarah to more comfortable surroundings, James found himself studying her face more carefully. Even in her current distressed state, he could see that she was probably quite beautiful under normal circumstances. More importantly, there was something in her features that spoke of intelligence and strength, qualities he had always admired. The baby's cries grew stronger as they moved him, and James surprised himself by reaching out to touch the infant's tiny hand. The child's fingers wrapped around his index finger with surprising strength, and James felt an unexpected surge of protective instinct. In that moment, looking at this unknown woman and her son, James made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. Sarah awakened to unfamiliar surroundings, her first instinct being to search for her baby. The room was unlike anything she had seen in months: clean white sheets, polished wooden furniture, and curtains that spoke of comfort and prosperity. Panic seized her until she heard the soft sounds of an infant nearby and turned to see her son sleeping peacefully in an improvised cradle made from a lined basket. "You're safe," came a deep voice from across the room. Sarah turned to see a tall man with graying temples and kind eyes standing near the window. His clothes marked him as someone of means: well-tailored pants, a quality cotton shirt, and boots that had seen work but were obviously expensive. "My baby," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from dehydration. "He's fine, fed and sleeping. Mrs. Henderson from the general store has been nursing him alongside her own child." The man approached slowly, as if afraid of startling her. "I'm James. My men and I found you on the church steps." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she could see the quality of the room and understood that this man had means. "I can't pay you," she said immediately, the words bitter in her mouth. "I have nothing left." "Payment wasn't discussed," James replied gently, settling into a chair near her bed. "Doctor says you need rest and proper food. When you're ready, perhaps you could tell me your name and how you came to be in such desperate circumstances." Sarah studied his face, searching for signs of judgment or ulterior motives, but found only genuine concern. In her experience, men with power rarely helped without expecting something in return, yet this stranger had provided her and her child with clean lodging and care. "Sarah," she said finally, "my husband Thomas was killed in the mine collapse 6 weeks ago. The company—" She paused, the familiar anger and frustration rising in her throat. "They paid $12 for a man's life and turned us out when I couldn't pay the rent." James had heard about the mine accident. 3 men had died when a support beam failed in the deeper tunnels, and the mining company had quickly dismissed it as an unfortunate accident. He had thought little of it at the time, focused as he was on his own business concerns, but now he was seeing the human cost of such corporate indifference. "You worked before your marriage?" he asked, nodding the intelligence in her eyes and the way she spoke. "I was a teacher in Philadelphia before I married Thomas. We came west for the opportunities, the chance to build something together." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke of her past. "I taught the children in the mining camp for a while until—" She gestured toward the sleeping baby. "You could teach again," James suggested. "Cedar Falls has been talking about hearing a proper schoolmarm. Most of the children here get little education beyond what their parents can provide." Sarah shook her head sadly. "No one will hire a woman with an infant, especially not a woman with no references, no permanent address, and no family to vouch for her character. I've already tried the neighboring towns." The conversation was interrupted by Doctor's arrival. The elderly physician examined both Sarah and her son, pronouncing them both much improved but still in need of careful attention. As he prepared to leave, he pulled James aside for a private conversation. "She's been starving herself to feed that baby," Doctor said quietly. "Another day or 2 without help and we might have lost them both. You did a good thing, James." After the doctor left, James found himself drawn into longer conversations with Sarah. Despite her current circumstances, she was clearly educated and articulate. She spoke knowledgeably about books, current events, and had opinions on everything from territorial politics to agricultural improvements. James, who spent most of his time with ranch hands and business associates, found her conversation refreshing and stimulating. "You said you've tried other towns for teaching positions," James said during one of their talks. "What exactly happened?" Sarah's cheeks colored slightly. "The school board-in was interested until they learned I was a widow with a child. The superintendent in Pine Ridge said they needed someone who could give their full attention to the students. In Copper Creek, they were concerned about my moral character. Apparently, a woman alone with a baby raises questions about her virtue, regardless of a wedding ring." The injustice of it stirred something protective in James. He had built his success by recognizing talent and potential where others saw only obstacles. Looking at Sarah, he saw a woman of obvious intelligence and character who was being punished for circumstances beyond her control. "The territorial legislature has been pushing for more schools," James mused aloud. There's talk of requiring formal education in every settlement of a certain size. That means opportunity for qualified teachers. Opportunity for the right kind of teachers, Sarah corrected gently. Single women with no encumbrances, or married women whose husbands can support them while they work for minimal wages. James spent the next few days visiting Sarah and her son regularly, bringing books from his hotel room and news from around town. He learned that she had read extensively, could speak some French and German, and had innovative ideas about childhood education that impressed even him. More importantly, he began to see past her current desperate circumstances to the remarkable woman underneath. The baby, whom she called William after his father's middle name, began to thrive under proper care and nutrition. Sarah herself regained strength daily, though James noticed she still jumped at unexpected sounds and seemed constantly worried about overstaying her welcome or becoming a burden. On the fourth day, James made a proposal that surprised even him. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began carefully. "What if there was a way for you to teach without having to convince a traditional school board of your worthiness?" Sarah looked up from feeding William, curiosity replacing the wariness that had become her default expression. "What do you mean?" "My ranch covers nearly 50,000 acres. There are dozens of families scattered across that land, cowboys with children, farmers who lease grazing rights, even some of my business associates who built homes in the area. Their children receive little or no formal education because the distances are too great for a traditional school." James paused, watching her reaction carefully. "What if you were to establish a school on my property? I could provide a building, supplies, whatever you needed. The families would pay what they could afford, and I would supplement the rest to ensure you received a proper salary." Sarah stared at James for a long moment, certain she had misunderstood his proposal. In her experience, offers that seemed too generous usually came with hidden costs that revealed themselves later. Yet as she studied his face, she saw none of the calculating expressions she had learned to recognize in men who sought to take advantage of desperate women. "You would do this for a stranger?" she asked carefully. "Provide a building, supplies, and guarantee my salary. What would you expect in return?" James had anticipated this question and respected her caution. Any woman who had survived what she had been through would be wary of seemingly generous offers from wealthy men. "I would expect you to provide quality education for the children on my land and the surrounding area. Nothing more, nothing less. And if I proved unsatisfactory, if the families complained or the arrangement didn't work as planned, then we would discuss the problems and work toward solutions, just as any employer and employee would do." James leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, I'm not offering charity disguised as employment. I'm proposing a legitimate business arrangement that would benefit both of us." The idea was appealing, almost too much so. Sarah had dreamed of having her own school since her teaching days in Philadelphia, but she had never imagined it might be possible on the frontier. Still, questions plagued her mind about the practicality and propriety of such an arrangement. "What would people say about an unmarried woman working so closely with you? About me living on your property?" The concerns that had made other positions impossible would surely apply here as well. "There are already several families living on ranch land in various capacities," James explained. "You wouldn't be the only woman, and you certainly wouldn't be living in my house. I was thinking of the old Henderson place about 3 miles from the main ranch. It's been empty since they moved to town, but it's still sound. Large enough for a schoolroom and living quarters for you and William." The more James talked about his idea, the more real it became in Sarah's mind. She could envision teaching children of various ages, creating lesson plans suited to frontier life, building something meaningful and lasting. Yet doubt continued to gnaw at her. "Why," she asked simply, "why would you invest so much in helping me?" James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. The truth was complex, involving his growing admiration for her intelligence and strength, his respect for her dedication to her child, and something deeper that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I've spent 20 years building my ranch," he said finally. "I've focused on cattle and land and profit, and I've been successful at it. But success means nothing if it doesn't benefit the community around you. Good education creates stronger communities, and stronger communities create better business." It was a reasonable answer, though Sarah sensed there might be more to his motivations than simple civic duty. She had noticed the way he looked at her during their conversations, not with the predatory interest she had learned to fear from other men, but with something that might have been respect or even admiration. "I would need to see the property," she said slowly, "to understand what would be required, what kind of space we're discussing. Of course, when you're feeling stronger, we can ride out and look at it together." The next morning brought unexpected complications in the form of Mrs. Whitman, the self-appointed guardian of Cedar Falls' moral standards. The formidable woman arrived at the hotel demanding to speak with James about the improper situation he had created by housing an unmarried woman in his rooms. "Mister," she announced, sweeping into the hotel lobby with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "the decent women of this town are quite concerned about the example being set. A respectable businessman entertaining an unmarried woman of questionable background is simply not acceptable." James had dealt with Mrs. Whitman's interference before and had little patience for it now. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm providing temporary assistance to a woman and child in desperate need. If you find Christian charity objectionable, perhaps you should examine your own conscience." "Christian charity is one thing," the older woman replied stiffly. "But housing her in your private rooms, spending hours alone with her, creating the appearance of impropriety is quite another. What do you really know about this woman? Where did she come from? Why was she alone and destitute?" Unfortunately, Mrs. Whitman's concerns were echoed by others in the community. Sarah overheard whispered conversations when she ventured downstairs, caught the disapproving glances of women who had previously shown her kindness. The gossip mill of a small frontier town was efficient and merciless. The situation grew more complicated when Mr. Bradley, the president of the Territorial Education Board, arrived in town for his annual inspection tour. Mrs. Whitman wasted no time in informing him about James's plan to establish an independent school on private property. "Such arrangements are highly irregular," Bradley told James during their meeting at the bank. "The territorial government prefers centralized education administered through proper channels. A private school operated by a teacher of questionable background could set a dangerous precedent." James found his temper rising. "The woman is a qualified teacher with years of experience. She's in difficult circumstances through no fault of her own, and I'm offering her legitimate employment." "Be that as it may," Bradley continued, "any school operating in this territory must meet certain standards and obtain proper certification. The teacher must pass examinations and provide character references from previous positions." This presented a nearly insurmountable obstacle. Sarah's previous employment had been in Philadelphia, and obtaining references would require time and correspondence that might prove impossible. Moreover, her subsequent work in the mining camp had been informal, leaving her with no official documentation of her teaching abilities. That evening, James found Sarah sitting by the window in her room, holding William and staring out at the darkening sky. The weight of the obstacles they faced was evident in her posture. "You've heard about the complications," she said without turning around. "Temporary setbacks," James replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced of this himself. "We'll find a way around them." "Will we?" Sarah's voice carried a note of resignation that troubled him. "Perhaps I should accept that this was a beautiful dream but not a practical reality. Maybe it's time for me to consider other options." "What other options?" James asked, genuinely curious about what alternatives she might have. "There's a family in Denver looking for a governess for their children. The position includes room and board for both William and me. It wouldn't be teaching in a formal sense, but it would be honest work with steady wages." The thought of Sarah leaving, of taking her son and disappearing into another life, struck James with unexpected force. Over the past week, he had grown accustomed to their daily conversations, to seeing her strength and intelligence emerge as she recovered from her ordeal. The possibility of losing that connection disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. "Denver is a long way from here," he said carefully, "and working as a governess in someone else's home. You'd be entirely dependent on their goodwill and whims." "I'm already entirely dependent on your goodwill," Sarah replied gently. "At least in Denver, the arrangement would be clearly defined and socially acceptable." As they talked, James realized that his feelings for Sarah had grown beyond simple charitable concern or business interest. Somewhere in the process of helping her, he had begun to care about her future in a deeply personal way. The challenge now was determining whether those feelings were reciprocated, and whether they could overcome the practical obstacles that seemed to multiply daily. The solution came from an unexpected source. Doctor, who had been quietly observing the mounting obstacles to Sarah's teaching position, arrived at the hotel with a proposal that surprised everyone involved. He carried with him a leather satchel filled with letters and documents that he placed carefully on the table in James's suite. "I've been corresponding with colleagues in Philadelphia," the elderly physician announced. "It turns out that Sarah's reputation there was quite remarkable. I have here letters from the superintendent of schools, 3 fellow teachers, and even the mayor's wife, all attesting to her character and abilities." Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized the letterhead from her former school district. "How did you manage this?" "Old friendships and professional courtesy," Doctor replied with a slight smile. "I trained in Philadelphia before coming west, and I've maintained correspondence with several colleagues there. When I explained the situation, they were eager to help a fellow educator in distress." The letters painted a picture of Sarah as an innovative and dedicated teacher who had been highly regarded by students, parents, and administrators alike. Her departure to marry and move west had been considered a significant loss to the Philadelphia school system. James examined the documents carefully, recognizing their potential value in dealing with territorial bureaucracy. This should address Mr. Bradley's concerns about references and qualifications. "There's more," Doctor continued. "I've also been in contact with several families throughout the territory who have expressed interest in quality education for their children. It seems that word of your proposed school has traveled, and there's considerable enthusiasm for the project." The doctor spread out additional papers showing inquiries from families as far as 50 miles away, asking about enrollment possibilities and boarding arrangements for children from distant homesteads. The demand for education was clearly greater than anyone had realized. "Some of these families are willing to pay quite well for proper schooling," James noted, studying the correspondence. "This could be more than just a local arrangement." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. The scale of what they were discussing had grown beyond her original expectations, bringing both opportunities and responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. "There's one more thing," Doctor said, producing a final document with an official territorial seal. "I took the liberty of consulting with a lawyer friend about the regulatory requirements. It turns out that private schools operating on private land have considerably more flexibility than public institutions, provided they meet basic educational standards." The document outlined a path forward that would satisfy territorial requirements while allowing Sarah the freedom to establish the kind of innovative educational program she had always envisioned. It would require examinations and inspections, but these seemed manageable obstacles rather than insurmountable barriers. Mrs. Whitman's moral objections proved more persistent than the bureaucratic ones. Her campaign against the arrangement had gained support among some of the town's more conservative residents, who viewed any deviation from traditional social structures with suspicion. The matter came to a head during the monthly town meeting, where Mrs. Whitman formally requested that the town council condemn James's plan as morally inappropriate. She argued that housing an unmarried woman on his property, even for legitimate business purposes, set a dangerous precedent that could corrupt the community's values. James had prepared for this confrontation, but Sarah surprised everyone by asking to address the council herself. Standing before the assembled townspeople with William in her arms, she spoke with quiet dignity about her circumstances and aspirations. "I understand the concerns about propriety," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded meeting room. "6 months ago, I was a respectable married woman with a secure future. Today, I'm a widow struggling to provide for my child and contribute meaningfully to my community. I didn't choose these circumstances, but I refuse to let them define my character or limit my potential." She went on to describe her vision for education that would serve children across the territory, providing opportunities that many families could never otherwise afford. Her passion and intelligence were evident as she outlined curriculum ideas adapted to frontier life, combining traditional academic subjects with practical skills needed for success in the developing West. "Mr. has offered me a chance to use my abilities in service of our children's future," Sarah concluded. "I intend to prove worthy of that opportunity, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of every child who deserves better than ignorance and limited prospects." The tide of opinion began to shift during that meeting. Several parents spoke up about their children's educational needs, and even some of Mrs. Whitman's supporters seemed swayed by Sarah's presentation. The council ultimately voted to support the establishment of the school, provided it met all territorial requirements. In the weeks that followed, James and Sarah worked together to transform the old Henderson place into a proper school. The main room became a classroom with desks James had ordered from Denver, while the smaller rooms provided living quarters for Sarah and William. They installed a library corner, a science area with specimens and simple equipment, and even a small workshop for practical skills training. The first students arrived in early September, a mix of ranch children and town youngsters whose parents preferred Sarah's innovative approach to traditional schooling. The class ranged in age from 6 to 16, requiring creative teaching methods that challenged and excited both Sarah and her students. As autumn deepened, James found himself spending increasing amounts of time at the school, officially to ensure the project's success, but increasingly because of his growing attachment to Sarah and her son. He helped with building improvements, assisted with supplies and equipment, and often stayed for evening meals that Sarah prepared for anyone who remained after regular school hours. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on mutual respect, shared interests, and the satisfaction of creating something meaningful together. James discovered that Sarah challenged his thinking about business, community responsibility, and personal priorities. Sarah found in James a partner who respected her intelligence and supported her ambitions without trying to control or diminish them. The proposal, when it finally came, surprised neither of them. James asked Sarah to marry him on a crisp December evening as they watched William take his first tentative steps across the schoolroom floor. It was not a proposal born of pity or convenience, but of genuine love and partnership. "I want to build a life with you," he said simply. "Not because you need rescuing, but because you make me a better man, and because together we can accomplish things neither of us could achieve alone." Sarah's answer came after a moment of careful consideration, not because she doubted her feelings, but because she wanted to ensure their partnership would be built on equality rather than dependence. "Yes," she said finally, "but on the condition that the school remains mine to run as I see fit. I won't trade one form of dependence for another." James smiled, recognizing the strength and independence that had first drawn him to her. "I wouldn't want it any other way." Their wedding took place the following spring in the same church where Sarah had collapsed months earlier. The entire community attended, including many of the families whose children attended Sarah's school. Mrs. Whitman, while not entirely approving of the unconventional courtship, grudgingly admitted that the match seemed to work well for all involved. The school continued to grow and prosper, eventually becoming a model that other communities throughout the territory sought to emulate. Sarah and James built not just a successful marriage, but a partnership that enriched both their lives and their community, proving that sometimes the most desperate circumstances can lead to the most unexpected and rewarding opportunities.